earlier this week, the U.S. decided to send the warships to the coast of Venezuela, and they even carried out an attack on the boats carrying some, passengers going to an island, and claimed that the vessel, that the boat, it was a tiny boat carrying a few people, they targeted it, blew it up and sunk the boat, and claimed that these are like drug cartels. And so basically, they are trying to load up the justification to go to war with Venezuela. And if you look at what the US have been doing, even from the first period of the Trump administration, is trying to force Venezuela to a position of acquiescence, making all these arguments that Venezuela is is somehow supporting the some of these cartels and some of these drug cartels that are running around, and they're loading America with a lot of fentanyl, and all sorts of narcotics, and that Venezuela and Maduro in particular is responsible. So today's conversation is about Venezuela. Um, if you're just joining, you're welcome. If I can, I'm going to show you. Um, so today's section is going to be very informative. Don't forget to like, share, and participate in the conversation. Don't forget to like, share, and participate in the conversation. I'm trying to get the map, and before we begin, like I said, don't forget to like, share, leave a comment, and if you have any question, I would also respond to the question in that regard. So the conversation is about what the US is doing in Venezuela. And the history goes back a long time. It didn't just start from this president. So there's this thing called the Monroe Doctrine that I will also talk about. I'll talk about the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine is, I'll also discuss that in essence and what the Monroe Doctrine is about, the context, the core principles of the Monroe Doctrine, the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, the later interpretations, the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine, what the US have done in the Americas in relations to the Monroe Doctrine. All of this will be, part of the conversation. All of this will be a segue, more or less, to the conversation, if you like, as we engage in this. Like I said, don't forget to share this video. The most important thing for you is to share it on your timeline or wherever you're watching it from. Share it, leave a comment. Thank you, Jessica. Alan, Ismail, thank you. Leave a comment on it. And even if I don't see it during the course of the broadcast, I will take a look at it after the broadcast and definitely respond to all your comments and all your. Don't also forget to like and share, like I said. So it's going to be about Venezuela and the US now playing a role and doing all of this in Venezuela. This miles, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, there's miles of ocean between America and Venezuela. And why is Venezuela so important to the United States? What is all of this about? Is this about the US again trying to intervene in the politics of other countries and making up this very insane excuse about you know uh, making up this insane excuse about drug trafficking and the role of all this cartel. Nobody believes that, as a matter of fact. There's nobody on earth that believes that nonsense that the US is talking about, and accusing Maduro of being behind. Thank you so much for the shares. So the US is accusing the president, and they're accusing Nicolas Maduro directly of, you know, I think it's better like this. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lolo. Thank you. Um, I would somehow try to expand the map for you guys to see. And it's not just about that, it's also them trying to start up some fight between Guyana and Venezuela. The war criminals need to be eliminated. I agree with you, Jessica Hijazi. Thank you. It's also the attempt to try to spare up something between Guyana and Venezuela. Welcome to this conversation, guys. It's going to be an interesting conversation. I hope this live stream section will go on for a bit, maybe a couple of, let's see, maybe a couple of hours. So today's conversation is about Venezuela and the recent tension between the United States of America and Venezuela. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. Like I said, if you're just joining me, welcome. Don't forget to share this video and get involved and get engaged in the conversation as we proceed. It's going to be an interesting conversation, guys. Don't forget to share the video as well. Um, so for Venezuela and the U.S. involvement, is it just about Maduro? It's about oil shortages and the U.S. trying to influence politics in the region and looking for sustenance, or is it the front line of centuries, old struggle between the empire and the independence of some of these countries in the Americas? We're also going to look at the history between the oil politics in Venezuela, the recent Trump intervention in the Americas, um, and the tension between the US and China and Russia and the future of Venezuela. Now let's look at the roots of the empire and the resistance. Now, and if you want to go back in history, but before we do that, let's also look at what is happening recently. In recent events, the US have decided. In recent events, the US have decided to position itself on the coast of Venezuela, claiming that it is there to stop the drug cartels from smuggling drugs into the US, and even placing a $50 million bounty on the head of the Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, and a host of other activities. And like I said, they targeted a boat carrying oil, a boat carrying, some individuals, citizens, by the way, of Venezuela, and just sunk the boat and killed all of them on board. So this is the nature, the level of brutality of American politics. All of this is for profit. Now let's look at the roots of the U.S. intervention in the Americas and the sort of politics that they are playing in the region. So I want to go back to how it all started. We talk about the roots of the empire, the decolonization in the Americas, and we also talk about the Monroe Doctrine and the U.S., the United States of America. We talk about issues relating to the oil and modern Venezuela and a host of other issues that we will be discussing today. So why is the U.S. so obsessed about Venezuela? And what is the issue? There's also the whole stuff about territorial claim between Guyana and Venezuela, and they're fighting each other. And the U.S. also getting involved in it and saying, "Oh, we're going to support Guyana." All of this is because of I think it's because of the hatred for Maduro, and largely for the structure of the Venezuelan state. They want Venezuela to come to acquiescence. And in relation to the territorial claim, Venezuela contests the legitimacy of the 1899 arbitration award that granted most of the Essequibo to Guyana, claiming parts of the regions rich in minerals and more recently oil are rightfully Venezuelan territory. Now in 2023, we'll also look at the 2023 agreement. So in December 2023, President Maduro and Ali, which is the president of Guyana, agreed in St. Vincent and the Grenadines not to use force in resolving the dispute. However, Guyana have since accused Venezuela of violating both this agreement and the 2023, which was signed in 2023, binding order from the International Court of Justice by escalating provocative actions. And in recent escalation as well, land and security incidents, the ambush on Guyanese soldiers in 2025, where at least 6 soldiers were wounded in an ambush was suspected Venezuelan militant members across the Uyuni River. The actions have been perceived as a proxy effort by Caracas to increase pressure, and 6 GDF personnel were injured in that. The Guyanese Defense Forces, their personnel was injured in an attack likely to be a proxy operation. They are not saying that it was the Venezuelan army that did it directly, but proxies of Venezuela, they accused, were involved in that operation, and accusing the Venezuelan government and Nicolas Maduro in particular of also being behind it and played some sort of role in it. And this is what they are creating. There are also maritime incursions. On March the 1st as well, 2025, there was another incident when the Venezuelan Coast Guard ship entered Guyanese exclusive economic zone and approached offshore oil infrastructure, notably the Exxon's starboard block FPSO vessels like Prosperity and Lizard Destiny. Now challenge the vessels and the disputed water. So America is now tapping into Guyanese oil and playing like ExxonMobil and I think Chevron in that territory that is disputed in what Venezuela called the disputed area, trying to drill for oil. Although they had an agreement in 2023 or 2025 not to settle it with force, but Guyana have gone ahead to get the Americans to get involved in it, to give them backing in order for them to drill and take out the resources. And there's also the disputed elections in disputed region. Despite the ICJ warning, Venezuela held a regional election in the Espino area because Venezuela controls most of it, appointing regional officials. Now the actions was denounced by Guyana and the international observers as illegitimate and so on and so forth. And in advance, Guyana filed for provisional measures to the ICJ to stop the elections, citing threats to sovereignty and irreparable harm. So although this territory is largely under the control of Venezuela, Guyana is making a claim that that territory, they don't have legitimacy over it, and seeking help from the United States at a point in time when Venezuela is at its lowest ebb. So this is an interesting, build-up and scenario in terms of, what is going on in the region. So we're also looking at the U.S. and the broader geopolitical involvement. Now, U.S. naval presence, like I said earlier, the U.S. now deployed warships into the area, into Venezuelan territorial waters, by the way. The U.S. is militarizing the whole area and claiming that it's there for, to stop the cartels, which in essence is there to protect the economic interests of the United States. Because now they are drilling for oil and they tapping into the resources in an area that is already disputed. So tensions have intensified, and continue to intensify as the U.S. naval activities in the South Caribbean, including operations against Venezuelan so-called linked drug traffickers under President Trump's directive, and claiming clearly, America making a clear statement that they are giving back into Guyana. So the U.S. has backed Guyana diplomatically, using language such as unacceptable to describe Venezuela incursion and warning of consequence for further provocations. So this is the U.S. Getting involved in another conflict in the Americas for its benefit. And we will look at the long list of the U.S. involvement in the Americas, and as we continue to discuss this topic. So I'll give you a long list why the U.S. got involved in the Americas, and they're doing that under the guise of what they call the Monroe Doctrine. And this is what I would I'll give you guys some insight into that. Like I said, if you're just joining, if any question you have, I'm going to respond to them. And if there's any way you want to participate in the conversation, let's continue to engage. So the Monroe Doctrine is one of the most important pillars of U.S. foreign policy. It was first articulated on December 2nd, 1823 by President James Monroe in his annual message to Congress. Now we'll look at some of the context of this, the key points of the Monroe Doctrine and what the Monroe Doctrine is about. Now, the context of the Monroe Doctrine, at the time, most of Latin America had recently won independence from Spain and from Portugal. European powers like the Holy Alliance, which is Russia, Prussia, which is modern-day Germany, Austria, and France, were considering helping Spain reclaim most of its lost colonies. The United States and Britain's encouragement, uh, with Britain's encouragement, wanted to prevent Europe from reasserting colonial control of the Western Hemisphere. So the core principles of the Monroe Doctrine: no new European colonization will be accepted in the Americas, that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subject for future colonization by the European powers. So the US is now stating clearly that any sort of colonization or recolonization of the Americas by the European powers will not be accepted. And secondly, the idea of non-interference. Europe should not interfere in the newly independent nations of Latin America. The third one is US neutrality. The US will not interfere in European internal affairs or on their existing colonies like Cuba and so on and so forth. And initially, the doctrine was more symbolic than practical because the US had little military power. And Britain's powerful navy, which also wanted to block Spain from regaining reclaiming colonies, also helped make the doctrine effective in practice. So Britain had the biggest navy at that time, and because America had made this pronouncement, Britain said, "Yeah, you can go ahead and do that, and we will support you." So this was an attempt at that time by the European powers, like I said, the Holy Alliance, Russia, Spain, and Portugal, wanting to reassert their control over the Americas, and the U.S. president at that time, Monroe, has stated clearly that any further European incursion into the Americas will not be accepted. So let's look at the later interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine. The reason I'm building all of this up is for you to understand the role that the United States of America have played in the Americas, constant intervention, claiming that the Americas, is the backyard of the United States of America. So it's not just Trump. Every American president have played a role in some sort of intervention in the Americas, and I'm going to adumbrate them one by one and explain them for you guys to understand. So the later interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine, over time the doctrine evolved with the Pope of 1840, used to justify expansion and oppose European interference in Mexico. The Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt expanded it, saying that the US had the right to intervene in the Latin American nations to stabilize them and keep Europeans out. So this is the justification that they gave, that the US need to intervene in the Americas to stabilize them, to keep the European powers out. And this justified the US military interventions across the region. And also during the Cold War period, the US used the doctrine to oppose Soviet influence in Cuba and the Americas. It wasn't just in Cuba with the removal of Fulgencio Batista in the 50s and with Fidel Castro, Raul, and Ernesto Che Guevara leading the rebellion that removed him. And the US even attempting what they call the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a project led largely by the CIA and Cuban dissidents trying to remove Fidel Castro from power. And we can also talk about their intervention in other countries in the Americas, like in Haiti, the support for the Duvalis, even up to the 90s, people like Leslie Francois Manigat were removed, people like John Bertrand Aristide, and a host of other areas we'll talk about. The support for dictators in the region like Rios Montt, the support of the Contras against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the removal of Salvador Allende, who was an elected leader, of Chile. They brutally removed Salvador Allende and backed the dictator Augusto Pinochet until the bitter end, and a host of other issues we will look at. Now, the legacy is that this became a cornerstone of the U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Latin American nations also criticized it, seeing it as a pretext for U.S. intervention and imperialism. And imperialism rather than true protection against Europe. So the claim is that, we are protecting you against Europe, we are doing X, Y, Z. But in reality, this was an attempt by America to exert its influence to continue to pillage, to destroy the Americas and exert political influence in the Americas, making this claim about, it's insane. So for those of you just joining, you're welcome. We're going to look at a list of countries, a few of them, that the US have directly intervened in the Americas. We're going to look at Caribbean and Central America. In Cuba, for instance, in 1898, the Spanish-American War, the U.S. occupied Cuba in 1898. In 1961, Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1962, to present the embargo on Cuba, plus CIA plots against Fidel Castro. In Haiti, 1915 to 1934, the U.S. Occupation of Haiti. From 94 to 2004, U.S. troops intervened for regime change in Haiti as well. In the Dominican Republic, between 1916 and 1924, with the U.S. intervening in Dominican Republic, which is a neighbor, by the way, of Haiti. They all live on the island of Hispaniola. And by 1965, the U.S. invasion to stop the leftist uprising in different countries in the Americas, including Nicaragua, which I mentioned, when Ortega, I think, and the Sandinistas came to power to remove, I think, the Contras, and they removed the dictator at that time, Anastasio Somoza. That depends on a lot of factors. We could still have an election in the United States. Yeah. Got me. Well, in the Dominican Republic, like I said, in 1965, I saw the U.S. invasion to stop a leftist uprising in the Dominican Republic. While in Grenada, in 1983, the U.S. invasion Operation Urgent Fury toppled the Marxist government. So if you look at the period of the Cold War, the U.S. consistent and persistent intervention in the Americas, the argument they made at that time was that, oh, we have the leftists coming to power, the Soviet Union and the communists are trying to take over power in the Americas, and we are going to prevent that. So the U.S. intervened in most of these countries brutally and barbarically, toppled government after government, clamped down on leaders in this government. The most savage and the most barbaric act you can see was carried out against the Americas. In as much as we are seeing the presence of America and the U.S. military power in Africa and in the Middle East, this is what they've been doing to the Americas since the late 1800s. So, and also in Grenada in 1983, the U.S. invasion, like I said, Operation Urgent Fury, which toppled the Marxist government. In Panama, in 1903, the U.S. backed Operation Separation from Colombia to secure the Panama Canal. And in 1989, the U.S. invasion to oust Manuel Noriega. We know about this incident and Manuel Noriega, claiming that, look, the Panama Canal belongs to Panama. Why should you guys control it? And they carried out different, attacks against Manuel Noriega. And also in Nicaragua, from 1912 to 1933, the U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua. And in the 1980s, the CIA backed the Contras, like I said, against the Sandinistas. And the most popular aspect of it is what they call the Iran-Contra affair, which you guys know about, which is the U.S. basically using Israel as an outlet to supply arms to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war to get funding, because the Congress at that point have denied funding to the Reagan administration because they were funding the Contras as against the Sandinistas that took over power from Anastasio Somoza, and they wanted to continue the funding, and this was under the Reagan administration. So what the U.S. did was a covert operation in order to sell arms to Iran to fight. And this is crazy because when Iran and Iraq were fighting, Iraq had most of their supplies from the United States. The same U.S. wanted to sell arms to Iran, but didn't want to sell arms directly to Iran because the student hostage crisis had happened in 1979 in Iran after the Shah came to power and the removal of the Shah. The Shah was removed from power, and the Khomeini, came to power after the Shah. I think Pahlavi, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was removed from power, and then they wanted to, the U.S. was not happy with that, and Iran and Iraq basically went to war, in a war largely instigated by the United States, and then, Saddam went to war with them, thinking he can stop the revolution from spreading, and that war cost and took the lives of over 2 million people. The U.S. gave arms to both sides to basically torture each other, and it's what is popularly known as the Iran-Contra affair. For those of you that want to know, which continued, and in Guatemala, by the way, the CIA backed the coup that ousted Jacobo Arbenz. In Guatemala, they backed the dictator General Osmond to take over power. And from the 60s to the 90s, the US also supported military governments during the brutal civil war, which from the late 60s to the early 90s or thereabout. They backed all sorts of government. And in South America, we talked about in Chile, the US in 1973, the CIA backed a coup against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende and installed General Augusto Pinochet. And in Brazil in 1964, the US also supported the coup against President João Goulart, and the military dictatorship was installed in Brazil. In Argentina in 1976, the US backed the military junta during the Dirty War period. In Uruguay in 1970, the US provided support to military government during Operation Condor. In Bolivia in 1971, the US supported the coup bringing Hugo Banza to power. And in 2019 in Bolivia as well, allegations of the US role in the crisis after the disputed election and they eventually forced Evo Morales to leave power. And by the way, Evo Morales is a guy that I've followed for a while. I think he's the first native guy in Bolivia to become president of the country. He's an indigene, he's a native of Bolivia, and he's the first one of that sort to become the leader of Bolivia. Bolivia is it's a beautiful country, for those of you that want to visit La Paz. Peru is another one. Between the 60s and the 70s, the CIA attempted to influence different military governments, in Peru. And in Ecuador in the 60s, the CIA interventions to weaken leftist governments. Of course, in Venezuela in 2002, the US tacitly supported the coup against Hugo Chavez. Remember, there was this brief coup against Hugo Chavez. They removed him from power and later reinstated him in power in Venezuela. And from there, they continued to attempt, to take his life. Who, by the way, eventually died of cancer about 4 or 5 years ago. And as well in 2019, remember, and this was when Trump was president, in 2019, they decided to back Guaido as interim president, undermining Maduro, because Guaido have gone to elections with Maduro, lost, and then declared a parallel government and claimed that he's the leader of the country, or somewhat. And then, the US backed him up and said if they lock him up, that the US will attack, Venezuela and so on and so forth. So in North America, between 1846 and 1848, the US invasion of Mexico during the US-Mexican War, which annexed half of Mexico. They took half of Mexican land. And in 1914, the US Navy bombarded Veracruz. In 1916, between 1916 and 1917, the US military expedition against Pancho Villa. I had this conversation with the guy that was talking about Pancho Villa. And I hope it's a conversation we can have another day against, in this regard. But the US actually led the military expedition against Pancho Villa. And the patterns coups, the back dictators like in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Guatemala, Bolivia, Dominican Republic, in Haiti. And in some cases, it's direct bombings and invasion like in Mexico, Cuba, like the one they did in the Bay of Pigs, the Dominican Republic, in Grenada, in Panama, Haiti, the support for authoritarian regimes like in El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and Argentina, and Uruguay. So the list is endless. This is how the US, constantly intervene in the politics of the Americas, And also, like I said, and the reason I'm giving this is for you to understand what the United States have been doing in the region. And whatever tension is building up between the United States and Venezuela today is not new. They are doing this for economic interest. They are doing this for power projection, because this is what they said. And they're saying this on the backdrop of what they call the Monroe Doctrine, which I had explained earlier. The US is doing this directly because they believe that the Americas is the backyard of the United States of America. And because of that, it's within their sphere of influence. Now let's look at the history of the decolonization in the America. And we're going to look at one guy today called Simón Bolívar. Now, the colonial background: for 300 years, Venezuela and most of Latin America were under the Spanish colonial rule. The colonies were heavily exploited, for gold, cocoa, coffee, oil, and for other reasons. And the colonies were heavily exploited, like I said, for their coal. They have cocoa, they have coffee, they later had oil. The society was divided: Spanish-born elites, which they call the Peninsulares versus the Creoles, who are the local born of Spanish descent, or the indigenous people. Others are enslaved Africans and mestizos. And the resentment, against foreign intervention and rule, which later led to the independence movement that continued to spread after the Napoleonic Wars and weakened Spain. Now, the rise of Simón Bolívar from 1783 to 1830, he was born into a wealthy Creole family in Caracas, which is in Venezuela today. And he traveled to Europe inspired by the Enlightenment age and the French Revolution. Saw Napoleon crown himself emperor and also realized Europe's weakness and became a key revolutionary leader in Venezuela's independence struggle. So it's from Venezuela, the Simón de Bolivar. And by 1810, Caracas declared autonomy from Spain in the start of the Venezuelan War of Independence. And by 1811, the Fourth Venezuelan Republic was declared, collapsed quickly due to civil strife, during the period of civil war as well. And from between 1813 and 1819, Bolivar launched the admirable campaign liberating Caracas, but faced a lot of setbacks. And by 1819, there was a victory at the Battle of Boyaca, which is in Colombia today, which was the turning point of the uprising and the revolution that was led by Simón de Bolivar. And by 1821, there was decisive victory at the Battle of Carabobo, which secured Venezuelan independence. So by 1821, Venezuela, had a decisive victory, at the Battle of Carabobo. So what is Bolivar's dream? Who is Simón Bolivar? What was his dream? What was his whole idea of trying to decolonize the America? Bolivar wasn't just fighting for Venezuela. He envisioned a united Latin America free from foreign domination. So he wanted unity. He wanted a united, just like you have the United States of America, he wanted a united Americas. Not divided into small places like you have today. You have all these tiny countries. He wanted a united, a dream was to have a United States of the Americas. So, which will be free from foreign domination. So he created the Grand Colombia, which is the modern day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. He advocated for a strong central government to avoid fragmentation. And the famous line is the United States seemed destined for providence to plague America with misery in the name of liberty. Prophetic critique of US intervention. Who said this? Simón de Bolivar, in the late 18th century, around 1821 or thereabout. This was what Simón Bolivar said. It's a famous line. The United States of America seems destined for providence to plague America with misery in the name of liberty. The US was trying to use liberty to plague the Americas with violence and conflict so that they can exploit them. So let's look at Bolivar and what happened to his vision. So the Grand Colombian fractured and Venezuela separated in 1830. Now, Bolivar died the same year. The solution saying America is ungovernable. Those who served the revolution have, blocked the sea. And despite this, he became the symbol of Latin America independence and resistance against imperialism. Now, let's look at the decolonization beyond Venezuela. Now, Bolivar's campaign liberated most of northern part of Southern America, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, which was named after him, and Panama. Now, the parallel revolutions led by Jose de San Martin in South America also led to the independence of countries like Argentina, Chile, and Peru. And by the 1820s, Spain has lost most of its colonies in the Americas, except Cuba and Puerto Rico. This wave marked the first great decolonization movement in the modern world. It was the first time in history. The natives, the locals, and a mix of everything in between, standing up against the West, standing up against the Europeans and saying enough is enough, pack your bags and leave. So what is the legacy of the modern Venezuela? Now, Bolivar is called El Libertador, meaning the liberator. Now, Hugo Chávez renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in 1999, tying his socialist project to Bolivar's anti-imperialism. So it was Venezuela, but he named it the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, tying his socialist project to Bolivar's anti-imperialism. Chávez and Maduro present themselves as heirs to Bolivar's struggle, framing the US as a new colonial empire, and with the Bolivarian rhetoric resisting foreign intervention, promoting regional security and defending the sovereignty. of their country. So this is the background to the independence of the Americas and the role that the U.S. have constantly and persistently played in the Americas in terms of kicking one government out after another and so on and so forth. And again, like I said, it's not just about Maduro. It was Hugo Chavez before him. But the U.S. have also tried to assassinate the leader, Nicolas Maduro, a couple of times after he took over power from Hugo Chavez. Now, the event happened on the 4th of August 2018. Now, during the military parade in Caracas celebrating the 81st anniversary of Venezuela's National Guard, Maduro was giving a televised speech. Suddenly, two drones armed with explosives detonated near the stage. Chaos erupted. Maduro's security rushed to shield him with bulletproof shields. Soldiers scattered and a live broadcast was caught. Maduro was unharmed, but 7 soldiers were injured as a result of that. Now, Maduro blamed the U.S. directly for it. Colombia, he blamed a couple of people. He blamed the Colombian president's son, Juan Manuel Santos, who's allegedly coordinating with Venezuelans in exile, and the United States of America under Donald Trump, claiming the U.S. agencies supported the plot. Now, the quote from Maduro: "They tried to assassinate me today, and everything points to the right wing in Venezuela, in alliance with Colombia and elements in Miami. These are the guys that want him gone." By the way, Miami have always been the center of some of these American, maybe it's because of the CIA. Maybe one of the office of the CIA is in Miami for plotting, the overthrow of some of these leaders or intervening in Latin American politics, as a matter of fact. This has always been the case. Over and over again, we have seen this same scenario with the U.S., intervening constantly in the politics of the Americas. Even during the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, they used the same place. Miami was the place they coordinated and boarded boats, to attack and try to remove the leader of Cuba at that time, Fidel Castro, from power. So Venezuelan authorities arrested dozens of suspects, including opposition activists and military officers. Some of the attackers were allegedly trained in Colombia and financed by exiled Venezuelans living in the U.S., particularly in Florida. Like I said, Miami in Florida. Drones they used the DJI Matrix 600 models modified with C4 explosives. Now, what was the U.S. response to this? The U.S. administration under Donald Trump at that time denied any involvement. The U.S. officials dismissed Maduro's accusation as a way to justify further crackdowns on the position. Still, this came amid Trump's open discussion of military options in Venezuela. On one hand, they were discussing and advocating for a direct intervention in Venezuela to overthrow Maduro from power. And when that happened, they denied, so we are not involved in this. This is not exactly the assassination of the Haitian president, Jovenel Moïse. Who are the mercenaries that did that? Colombian mercenaries, a few mercenaries from the United States. Every time this thing happened, the right-wing elements in Colombia, they're coming from Colombia and from Miami, doing the bidding of the United States in the region. Not in broad daylight, at night they went to the presidential palace and basically slain the leader of Haiti, Jovenel Moïse. And this was about 5 or 4 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Now let's look at the broader context of this. The assassination attempt was the first known drone attack on the head of a state in history. It highlighted Venezuela's deep domestic unrest, the extent of U.S. hostility towards Maduro, the growing use of technology. People talk about drone warfare and the fight between Russia and Ukraine. Well, these drones have been used against Maduro. It was the first time they tried to assassinate a leader with using drone. Where the United States have been using drone in Yemen, and Afghanistan and other places for a while. But to use that to try to assassinate a world leader, giving a speech on stage is crazy. Afterwards, Maduro launched a wave of arrests against alleged conspirators and accused Washington of sponsoring terrorism in Latin America. Now, why is this important to understand in terms of the trend between Maduro and Donald Trump recently? Now, reinforced Maduro's narrative as the U.S. was actively trying to eliminate him physically and not just politically, became a propaganda tool in Caracas to rally domestic